The rain comes down in sheets across the Louisiana darkness, each drop striking the tin roof of the Myrtles Plantation like a whispered warning. It's a sound that has echoed through this house for more than 2 centuries, a rhythm as familiar to the walls as the heartbeats of those who once lived here, and those who died here. Inside, in the hallway on the first floor, there hangs a mirror. It's an ordinary piece of Victorian furniture, or at least it should be. But visitors who pause before this mirror often notice something that makes their skin crawl. Handprints appear on its surface, small handprints that seem to press outward from within the glass itself. The staff has tried to clean them. They've used every solution imaginable, scrubbed until their arms ached, even replaced the glass entirely. But the handprints return, always the same size, always pressing from the impossible space behind the reflection. The Myrtles Plantation sits on land that was never meant to hold a house of the living. In 1796, when General David Bradford constructed his grand estate on these grounds, he built it directly atop a Tunica burial ground. The indigenous people who knew this land understood what he did not. Some ground remembers. Some ground refuses to forget. They call it one of America's most haunted homes, and the stories that seep from its walls are enough to chill the blood. There's Chloe, whose name is whispered with a mixture of pity and fear. There are the poisonings, a tale of revenge that echoes through the floorboards. And there are the 10 murders, 10 separate deaths that this property has witnessed, each one leaving its mark on the house that seems to absorb violence like a sponge absorbs water. But these are stories for later, secrets that unfold slowly in the darkness. What matters now is this. You're lying in one of the upstairs bedrooms, listening to the rain drum its ancient song against the windows. The house settles around you, creaking in ways that houses do, or at least in ways you tell yourself that houses do. Somewhere below, that mirror hangs in the hallway, reflecting a darkness that may contain more than just shadows. And as your eyes grow heavy, as sleep begins to pull you down into its depths, you have to wonder something. What happens when you fall asleep to the sound of rain in a house where the dead refuse to rest? Deep in the swamplands of Louisiana, where the mist clings to ancient cypress trees and the air hangs thick with secrets, there exists a piece of land that many believe was cursed from the moment the first foundation stone was laid, long before the white columns and wraparound porches of the Myrtles Plantation rose from the earth. This ground belonged to the Tunica people. For generations untold, they used these acres as sacred burial ground, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds touched, where the bones of ancestors rested in the dark soil, where ceremonies honored the dead and the living maintained a delicate balance with forces beyond human understanding. The Tunica understood what so many would later forget. Some places are meant to remain undisturbed. Some earth holds more than minerals and clay. It holds memory, reverence, and warnings that transcend language. The burial mounds that dotted this landscape were not mere graves, but sanctuaries, carefully chosen and consecrated through ritual and respect. To the Tunica, disturbing these grounds would be an act of violence against the natural order itself, an invitation for darkness to seep through the boundary between worlds. Then came 1796, and with it came General David Bradford. Bradford was not drawn to this isolated corner of Louisiana by its beauty or opportunity. He came as a fugitive, a man running from the long arm of federal justice. His crime was insurrection. During the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, Bradford had been one of the principal leaders of the uprising in western Pennsylvania, where farmers and distillers took up arms against the new federal excise tax on whiskey. When President George Washington himself led a militia force of nearly 13,000 men to suppress the rebellion, Bradford knew his fate was sealed. He could face trial for treason and likely execution, or he could disappear. He chose to disappear. The Louisiana Territory, still under Spanish control at the time, offered refuge for those who needed to vanish from the American legal system. Bradford traveled south with his family, carrying whatever wealth he could transport, seeking the most remote location he could find. He needed isolation, distance from prying eyes and federal marshals. What he found was 600 acres of dense Louisiana wilderness, land that locals whispered about, land that the Tunica people had long since abandoned, but still considered sacred. Bradford either did not know about the burial grounds or did not care. Perhaps in his desperation, he convinced himself that the warnings were mere superstition. Perhaps his own troubles seemed more pressing than respecting the dead of a displaced people. Whatever his reasoning, he began construction of what would become the Myrtles Plantation, driving posts and laying foundations directly over consecrated burial sites. The original structure was modest by plantation standards, a simple 8-room house that Bradford initially called Laurel Grove. But even in its humble beginnings, the house seemed to carry a weight, an atmosphere that visitors would later describe as oppressive. The workers who built it, many of them enslaved people, spoke quietly among themselves about strange occurrences. Tools would go missing and reappear in impossible locations. Sounds echoed from the ground itself, low moans that seemed to rise from beneath the foundation. Animals avoided certain areas of the property, their instincts warning them away from ground that had been violated. Bradford established his plantation on the backs of enslaved people, as was the brutal custom of the era. The violence of slavery, the systematic dehumanization and torture that defined the institution, now added its own layer of suffering to land already steeped in desecration. The fields that surrounded the main house became places of relentless labor under the Louisiana sun that lie. The quarters where enslaved people were forced to live stood as monuments to cruelty. Whippings, beatings, families torn apart, lives reduced to property, all of this darkness seeped into the soil alongside the outrage of disturbed graves. Some historians estimate that between 20 and 30 enslaved people worked the Myrtles during Bradford's ownership. Each one of them endured conditions we can barely fathom today. They worked from dawn until the light failed, hands bleeding, backs breaking, under the constant threat of violence. When they died, some were buried on the property in unmarked graves, their final rest yet another layer of troubled spirits bound to the cursed ground. Bradford himself did not live to see old age at the Myrtles. He died in 1808, having spent just 12 years on the property. But his choice to build upon sacred ground had already set something in motion, a foundation of transgression that would define the plantation for centuries to come. After Bradford's death, the property passed through the hands of his widow before being sold to Judge Clark Woodruff and his wife, Sarah Matilda. The Woodruffs expanded the original structure, transforming the modest house into a proper plantation manor. They added the ornate details that would become famous, the intricate ironwork, the crystal chandeliers, the French windows, and elaborate plasterwork. But no amount of beautiful craftsmanship could cleanse what lay beneath. The Woodruff era brought its own tragedies. Sarah Matilda died young. 2 of the Woodruff children succumbed to yellow fever, their small bodies racked with the disease as they died in the house. More enslaved people lived and died on the property during this period, their suffering compounding the spiritual debt accumulating in the land itself. The plantation changed hands again in 1834 when Ruff and Gray Sterling purchased the property. Sterling continued the expansion, adding more rooms, more luxury, more grandeur. The house grew like a living thing, spreading across the cursed ground. Each new addition another attempt to impose order and civilization on a foundation built on violation. The white columns rose higher. The porches wrapped further around the structure. The gardens became more elaborate, carefully manicured to create an illusion of paradise. But paradise cannot grow from poisoned roots. During the Sterling years, the plantation reached its peak as a functioning agricultural enterprise. At its height, the Myrtles enslaved dozens of people, their numbers fluctuating with births, deaths, purchases, and sales. The stories that would later emerge from this period paint a picture of routine brutality. Overseers who ruled with whips and chains. Families separated at auction blocks. Women subjected to sexual violence. Children born into bondage, knowing nothing but the plantation boundaries as their entire world. The Civil War brought its own chaos to the Myrtles. The plantation survived the conflict, but the social and economic order that had sustained it collapsed. The enslaved people gained their freedom, though many had nowhere to go and few resources to start new lives. The Sterling family struggled to maintain the property in the new reality of Reconstruction. By the time the 1880s arrived, the Myrtles had already witnessed nearly a century of death, suffering, and spiritual transgression. The land had absorbed it all. Every drop of blood spilled by the lash. Every tear shed by a mother torn from her children. Every final breath of fever victims. Every echo of the Tunica ancestors whose rest had been so violently disturbed. The house itself seemed to remember. its walls holding memories like a recording device made of wood and plaster. Local people began to speak more openly about the plantation being haunted, cursed, fundamentally wrong. They told stories of lights in windows when the house stood empty, sounds of footsteps in halls where no living person walked, apparitions glimpsed through the famous windows, faces that appeared and vanished. Some claimed to see Native American figures moving through the grounds at night, spirits of the Tunica people reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Others reported encountering the ghosts of enslaved people, still bound to the land even in death, unable to move on from the place of their suffering. Some witnesses described seeing a woman in period clothing wandering the property, her expression one of eternal grief. Others spoke of hearing children's laughter that turned to sobbing, echoing from rooms that stood silent and empty. The house continued to evolve through the late 1800s and early 1900s, passing through more owners, each adding their own modifications, each experiencing their own share of unexplained phenomena. The structure that stands today is a palimpsest of all these eras, layers upon layers of history and horror, beauty and brutality, all built upon that original sin of desecration. What makes the Myrtles particularly chilling is not just the individual tragedies that occurred there, though those are numerous and well documented. It is the cumulative weight of transgression, the way violation built upon violation, each generation adding to the spiritual debt. The Tunica burial ground provided the cursed foundation. The institution of slavery added decades of systematic cruelty. Natural disasters, diseases, and personal tragedies contributed their own dark chapters. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Myrtles Plantation stood as a monument to everything that can go wrong when human ambition ignores spiritual boundaries and basic human dignity. The dark foundation established by General Bradford in 1796 created ripples that extend to this day. Visitors to the Myrtles continue to report unexplained experiences, sensing presences, feeling watched by unseen eye. Paranormal investigators have recorded anomalies that defy conventional explanation. Photographers capture images of figures that were not visible to the naked eye. The land itself seems to resist peace, as though the original desecration created a wound that cannot fully heal. This is where the story of the Myrtles truly begins, not with ghostly apparitions or strange sounds, but with the choice to build upon sacred ground, to impose human will over spiritual law, to value profit and refuge over respect and reverence. Everything that followed, all the tragedy and terror, grew from those poisoned roots planted in 1796. In the antebellum South, freedom was a word that existed only in whispers for the enslaved. Among those who lived in bondage at the Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana, a woman known as Chloe navigated an impossible landscape of survival, one where every choice carried the weight of potential catastrophe, and where the margin for error simply did not exist. The historical record offers us fragments, pieces of a story that has been told and retold until the line between documented fact and embellished legend has blurred beyond recognition. What we know, or what the stories tell us, is that Chloe served in the main house under the ownership of Clark Woodruff, a man whose position of absolute power over the people he enslaved was reinforced by law, custom, and the brutal machinery of the plantation system. Working in close proximity to the family meant certain privileges, access to better food, shelter from the harshest field labor. But it also meant constant surveillance, constant performance, and constant danger. According to the legend that has persisted for generations, Chloe made a choice that would seal her fate. She began listening at doors, pressing her ear against the wood panels that separated the family's private chambers from the servants' passages. Perhaps she was seeking information that might protect her, rumors of financial troubles that could mean slaves being sold away, conversations about illness, or travel that might affect the household. Perhaps she had been coerced into this eavesdropping by Clark Woodruff himself, some versions of the story suggest. Forced into a relationship that left her desperate to maintain whatever fragile favor she had gained. Or perhaps she simply wanted to know what decisions were being made about her life, her future, her very existence. Whatever her motivation, she was caught. The punishment, according to the tale, was swift and brutal. Clark Woodruff ordered that her left ear be cut off, a mutilation that served multiple purposes in the cruel calculus of slavery. It marked her, It humiliated her. It served as a warning to every other enslaved person on the plantation about the consequences of transgression. And it was legal. Under the laws of Louisiana in the 1820s and 1830s, enslaved people were property, not persons. Their bodies could be altered, marked, and destroyed at the whim of their owners with virtually no legal consequence. Chloe began wearing a green turban, wrapping the fabric carefully around her head each morning to conceal the ragged scar where her ear had been. The turban became her signature, the detail that would echo through history and ghost stories, the single image that would define her in death even more than in life. Imagine the daily ritual of wrapping that cloth, the physical reminder of her powerlessness, the covering of a wound that would never truly heal. But the mutilation cost her more than her ear. Her position in the household became precarious. The family's trust, if such a thing had ever existed between enslaver and enslaved, was shattered. She could feel herself slipping from the relative safety of housework toward an uncertain future. In the rigid hierarchy of plantation life, falling from favor could mean being sent to the fields, sold away from any family or community she had managed to build, or worse, punishments that existed at the edges of imagination. Desperation breeds terrible choices. The legend tells us that Chloe formed a plan, one born from the distorted logic of someone with no good options, someone whose entire existence depended on the whims of people who viewed her as property. She would make the family sick, just sick enough to need nursing, and then she would care for them back to health. She would prove herself indispensable again. She would reclaim her position. She would survive. Oleander grew abundantly in Louisiana, its delicate pink and white flowers decorating the plantation grounds with deceptive beauty. Every part of the plant is toxic. The leaves contain cardiac glycosides, compounds that can cause nausea, vomiting, irregular heartbeat, and in sufficient quantities, death. But knowledge about dosing such poisons was imprecise, passed through oral tradition and folk understanding. Chloe had no access to medical texts, no way to calculate safe amounts. She was working in the dark, quite literally gambling with lives. The occasion was a birthday, one of the Woodruff daughters. Sarah Matilda Woodruff, Clark's wife, oversaw the kitchen's preparation of a cake, a special treat in a time when refined sugar was expensive and elaborate. Desserts were markers of wealth and status. At some point in the preparation, according to the story, Chloe added crushed oleander leaves to the batter. Just enough, she thought. Just enough to cause illness, but not harm. She was catastrophically wrong. Sarah Woodruff ate the cake. Two of her young daughters, whose names the legend most often gives as Cornelia and Mary, ate the cake as well. The symptoms would have begun within hours. Nausea, violent vomiting, abdominal pain. As the toxins entered their bloodstreams, their hearts would have begun to struggle, beating irregularly, unable to maintain the steady rhythm necessary for life. There would have been confusion, weakness, perhaps seizures, and there would have been nothing anyone could do. Medical care in rural Louisiana in the 1830s was limited under the best circumstances. For poisoning by oleander, there was no antidote, no treatment that could reverse the damage to the heart muscle. Sarah Woodruff died. Her two daughters died. The grief that descended on the household mixed with rage and the demand for vengeance. Clark Woodruff would have known that Chloe had access to the kitchen. Under interrogation, forced or otherwise, the truth or some version of it must have emerged. But here the story takes perhaps its darkest turn. It was not Clark Woodruff who executed the punishment. It was not white vigilantes or the legal system, such as it was. According to the legend, it was the other enslaved people on the plantation who dragged Chloe from wherever she had tried to hide. They took her to a tree somewhere on the property. They fashioned a noose. They hanged her. Understanding this requires grasping the brutal arithmetic of collective punishment that governed plantation life. When one enslaved person committed a crime, especially one as serious as the murder of white family members, the entire enslaved community faced potential retribution. Mass whippings, the selling away of families, restrictions on the tiny freedoms that made survival possible, or even executions could be inflicted on people who had nothing to do with the original act. The system was designed this way deliberately, turning enslaved people against each other, making them police their own communities out of fear. So they killed her. Whether they believed she deserved it, whether they hated her for what she had done, and the danger she had brought upon them all. Whether they acted out of pure terror for their own lives, we cannot know. The story does not give us their names or their words. It focuses, as ghost stories tend to do, on Chloe alone. Her body, the legend says, was weighted with rocks and thrown into the Mississippi River, erasing even the possibility of burial, of any marker or remembrance. But erasure, as it turns out, is never complete. Not long after, according to the tales that would grow around the Myrtles Plantation, people began seeing a woman on the grounds. She appeared between the columns of the house, standing in doorways, moving through rooms in the early morning or at twilight. She wore a green turban wrapped around her head. Sometimes she was described as carrying something, perhaps a tray or a bundle of herbs. Sometimes she appeared to children, standing at the foot of beds or outside windows. Always, she wore that green turban. The sightings accumulated over decades. Workers at the plantation reported encounters. Families who lived in the house during its various incarnations as private residence, boarding house, and eventually tourist attraction added their own experiences. Photographers claimed to capture her image on film, a figure in period clothing with fabric wrapped around her head appearing in frames where no one had stood during the shot. Visitors reported the smell of cooking, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing in patterns that suggested someone moving through the routine tasks of household work. Whether Chloe actually existed as a historical person remains unclear. Genealogical research into the Woodruff family raises questions about the legend. Some records suggest that Sarah Woodruff and her daughters died not in Louisiana, but in Mississippi, not from poisoning, but from yellow fever. Estate records and inventories from the plantation do not clearly document an enslaved woman named Chloe, though record-keeping for enslaved people was often incomplete, and many were listed only by first names or mark. But the persistence of the story tells us something true, even if the specific events are questionable. It tells us about the impossible positions that enslaved people navigated daily, the way that survival required constant calculation, the knowledge that protection could turn to danger in an instant. It tells us about punishments that were not only legal but expected, about bodies that could be altered and destroyed without consequence to the perpetrators. It tells us about the way that desperation can warp judgment, how someone with no power might grasp at any possibility of regaining even the smallest measure of control over their own fate. Chloe's story, true or embellished or entirely constructed from fragments of different events and people, is fundamentally a tragedy. Not a horror story, though it contains horrific elements. Not a tale of a malevolent spirit seeking revenge, though it has been told that way. It is the story of someone caught in a system that offered no escape, who made a terrible choice born from an impossible situation, and who paid with her life while the system that created her desperation continued, unchained. The woman in the green turban, if she walks through a landscape of grief, her own and that of the children, who died from her desperate gamble. She haunts not because she is evil, but because her story is unfinished, because justice in any meaningful sense was never possible for her in life. The antebellum South was a place where some people could own others, could mutilate them for small infractions, could work them until their bodies gave out. Chloe existed in that world, navigated as best she could, and when her navigation failed, she died for it. The ghost stories that tourists hear when they visit the Myrtles today often sanitize this history, turning Chloe into a figure of supernatural menace divorced from the brutal context of slavery. But the real haunting is not a spectral woman in a turban. It is the knowledge that everything in her story, the mutilation, the desperation, the poisoning, the lynching by her own community, was made possible by a legal and social system that defined human beings as property. That is the true horror, and it requires no embellishment to chill the blood. The mirror hangs in the upstairs hallway of Myrtles Plantation, 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, its ornate frame carved from Louisiana cypress in the 1800s. The glass itself predates even the frame, salvaged from an earlier structure, its surface rippling with the imperfections of 19th century manufacturing. Visitors who approach it often feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature, a wrongness that settles in the pit of their stomach as they draw near. What makes this particular mirror The most documented paranormal object in a house full of unexplained phenomena is not just the legend surrounding it, but the physical evidence that continues to manifest despite every rational attempt to explain it away. The story begins with an old superstition, one that crossed the ocean with settlers from Europe and took root in the Deep South with particular fervor. When someone dies, the mirrors in their home must be covered, shrouded in cloth, or turned to face the wall. The reason varies depending on who tells the tale. Some say mirrors can trap departing souls, preventing them from moving on to whatever awaits beyond. Others claim the reflection of a corpse in a mirror will doom the next person who looks into that glass. Still others believe mirrors serve as doorways, portals that swing both ways, and in the vulnerable hours after death, something might use that open door to slip through from the other side. Sarah Woodruff understood these customs. Born in 1822, she grew up in a household where such beliefs were taken seriously, where mirrors were draped with black crepe at the first sign of illness, just in case. When she married Clark Woodruff in 1839 and moved into Myrtles Plantation, she brought those superstitions with her. The household staff knew her particular concerns. They knew about the rituals she observed, the small protections she insisted upon, which makes what happened next all the more disturbing. In 1863, Sarah and her two youngest daughters, Octavia and Cornelia, fell suddenly ill. Some accounts say it was yellow fever, though the symptoms did not quite match. Others whisper of poisoning, of a servant's revenge for cruelties inflicted, of a slow death delivered through daily doses of something bitter hidden in the morning coffee. Whatever the cause, all three died within days of each other. Octavia was 3 years old. Cornelia was just past her second birthday. In the chaos and grief that followed, in the rush to prepare the bodies and arrange the funeral, someone made a mistake. Or perhaps it was not a mistake at all. Perhaps it was deliberate. The large hallway mirror, the one that reflected the entire upstairs corridor, the one positioned to catch the light from the eastern windows each morning, was never covered. While black cloth shrouded every other reflective surface in the house, this mirror remained bare, capturing the images of Sarah and her daughters as their bodies were carried past, as mourners climbed the stairs, as the household descended into anguish. According to the legend, their souls became trapped in that moment, pressed into the silver backing of the glass, unable to move forward, unable to escape. For years, the mirror hung there, just another piece of furniture in a house full of antiques. Then the handprints began to appear. The first documented account comes from 1897, when a new housekeeper named Margaret Ellis was tasked with cleaning the upstairs hallway. She later told her sister in a letter that she had polished the mirror thoroughly that morning, using vinegar and newspaper until the glass gleamed. When she returned that afternoon, there were marks on the surface. Not smudges or fingerprints of the sort you might expect from children playing in the hall. These were handprints that appeared to come from inside the glass itself, pressing outward. She could see the whorls of the fingerprints, the crease lines of the palms, all in reverse, as if someone behind the mirror had placed their hands against the back of the glass and pushed. 3 sets of prints, one belonging to an adult woman, her palm spanning roughly 7 inches. 2 smaller sets, child-sized, positioned lower on the mirror's surface, as if a mother and her 2 daughters were standing on the other side of that thin barrier between worlds, trying to get out. Margaret cleaned the prints away, scrubbing until her arms ached. The next morning they were back, in the exact same positions. This pattern has continued for over a century. Housekeepers throughout the 1900s reported the same phenomenon. Clean the mirror, and within hours or days the prints return. Always 3 sets. Always in the same configuration. Always appearing as though pressed from the interior of the glass, rather than applied to its surface. In 1946, a housekeeper named Dorothy Baines decided to document the phenomenon more carefully. She cleaned the mirror at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in March, then locked the hallway and kept the only key on her person. No one could access that corridor. She checked the mirror every 2 hours. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the prints appeared between one check and the next. The hallway had remained locked. The temperature was stable. There was no humidity, no condensation, no possibility of someone sneaking in to stage the marks. She tried an experiment. She dusted the mirror with talcum powder before cleaning it. a fine layer that would show any disturbance. When the prints appeared again, they pushed through the powder from beneath, disturbing it in a way that suggested movement from inside the glass outward. The modern era brought more sophisticated attempts at documentation and at explanation. In 1988, paranormal investigator Daniel Cross spent 3 weeks at Myrtles Plantation specifically studying the mirror. He set up video cameras trained on the glass 24 hours a day. He monitored humidity levels, temperature fluctuations, and air quality. He documented the prints appearing on film, manifesting over the course of approximately 40 minutes, starting as faint impressions and gradually becoming more pronounced until they reached full visibility. Cross brought in a materials scientist from Louisiana State University, a woman named Dr. Rebecca Chen, who specialized in glass composition and aging. She examined the mirror thoroughly, took samples from the frame, measured the thickness and curvature of the glass. Her analysis revealed something peculiar. The handprints did not exist on the surface of the mirror at all. When she used specialized equipment to measure the depth of the marks, she found they originated approximately 1/16 of an inch inside the glass itself, at the layer where the reflective silver backing had been applied in the 1800s. There was no known mechanism by which handprints could form within solid glass. No chemical process, no environmental factor, no physical force that could create such marks from inside a sealed object. Dr. Chen's official report stated she could not explain the phenomenon through conventional scientific means. Privately, she told Cross she had never encountered anything like it in 30 years of studying glass. The marks appeared to be physically impossible. In 2003, another team arrived with even more advanced equipment. They used thermographic cameras to track temperature variations, hoping to catch heat signatures that might explain the prints as some kind of thermal effect. What they captured instead deepened the mystery. The handprints appeared cold, not room temperature, but several degrees below the ambient air, as if something was drawing heat away from those specific spots on the glass. The cold spots appeared first, followed by the visible handprints, suggesting that whatever caused the marks also created localized cooling within the glass structure itself. A skeptical investigator in 2009 proposed that the prints were the result of residual oils in the glass, some kind of manufacturing impurity that created patterns resembling handprints through chemical processes over time. This theory fell apart quickly. Chemical residue would not appear and disappear on a schedule. It would not respond to cleaning. It would not manifest in the precise shape and size of human hands, complete with recognizable fingerprint patterns. Moreover, spectral analysis of the glass showed no unusual chemical composition in the areas where the prints appeared. The housekeeping staff who work at Myrtles today, now a functioning bed and breakfast and historical site, have made an uneasy peace with the mirror. Maria Gonzalez, who has cleaned the upstairs hallway for 15 years, describes her routine matter-of-factly. She cleans the mirror every morning, removing the previous day's prints. She uses regular glass cleaner, nothing special. By evening, when she does her final rounds, the prints have usually returned. She has stopped trying to understand it. What bothers her, she says, is not the fact of the prints themselves, but the feeling she gets when cleaning them. Her hands pass through where the child-sized prints appear, and the glass feels wrong in those spots. Colder, yes, but also somehow yielding, as if it is not quite solid, as if she is passing her cloth across something thinner than it should be, a barrier worn nearly transparent by over a century of pressure from the other side. Other staff members report similar sensations, a distinct feeling of being watched while in that hallway, particularly near the mirror. Some refuse to look directly into it, keeping their eyes averted as they pass. One housekeeper quit after she claimed she saw movement in the reflection, a shadow that should not have been there, the silhouette of a woman and two small figures standing motionless in the glass while the hallway itself remained empty. Visitors to Myrtles Plantation often try to witness the phenomenon themselves. They press their own hands against the glass, trying to match their prints to the ones that appear. The comparison is striking when both are visible. Modern handprints on the surface look exactly as you would expect, smudges of oil and moisture, slightly blurred. The other prints, the ones from inside, are eerily crisp, the ridge patterns sharp enough that forensic experts have stated they could lift usable prints if this were a criminal investigation. In 2015, a forensic specialist named James Whitmore did exactly that. using techniques designed to recover latent prints from difficult surfaces. He successfully lifted and analyzed the prints from inside the mirror. They belonged, unsurprisingly, to a woman and 2 young children. What he found remarkable was the pressure differential indicated by the prints. When you press your hand against a surface, the center of your palm typically shows lighter pressure than the fingertips and heel of the hand. These prints showed the opposite pattern, as if the hands had been pressing outward with maximum force at the palm's center, pushing against the glass with what he described as desperate intensity. The idea that Sarah Woodruff and her daughters might be literally trapped inside the mirror, conscious and aware, trying endlessly to break through, transforms this from a curious paranormal phenomenon into something approaching tragedy. If the old superstitions held truth, if mirrors could indeed trap souls, what would that existence be like? Suspended in a thin layer of silver and glass, able to see out into the world that continued without you, able to observe visitors passing by, seasons changing through the hallway windows, decades sliding past while you remained frozen in the moment of your death, able to do nothing but press your hands against an unyielding barrier in an eternal, futile attempt to escape. The mirror remains in the hallway where it has hung for nearly 2 centuries. Tours guide visitors past it daily, recounting the legend, pointing out the handprints if they happen to be visible that day. Photographs are encouraged. Some of those photographs, people claim, show additional figures in the background of the reflection, shapes that were not in the hallway when the picture was taken. No one has ever seriously suggested removing the mirror or covering it permanently. Perhaps because it has become too valuable as a historical curiosity, too central to the plantation's reputation. Or perhaps because some fear what might happen if you shrouded the mirror now, after all this time. Would it trap the souls more completely, cutting them off from even this limited contact with the living world? Or might covering it finally allow them to move on, to slip away to wherever they should have gone in 1863, when someone forgot or refused to cover the glass? The handprints appear and disappear with the rhythm of tides, following some pattern researchers have never quite mapped. Sometimes daily, sometimes with days between manifestations. But they always return, those 6 hands pressed against the inside of the glass, a woman and her children reaching toward a freedom that remains after more than 150 years, just barely out of reach. The rain comes differently at the plantation. Not in ordinary drops, but in sheets that seem to press against the windows with intention, as though seeking entry to something long familiar. For those who work here, who keep the grounds and guide the tourists through the carefully preserved rooms, there's a clear distinction between the quiet days and the rain days. When the storms roll in from the bayou, the house remembers. Sarah Thornton worked as a caretaker at the plantation for 7 years before she finally moved off the property. She lived in the converted overseer's cottage at the edge of the main grounds, close enough to respond to any emergency, close enough to hear everything. During her first autumn there, she remembers standing on her small porch as a thunderstorm approached, watching the main house hunker down beneath the darkening sky like something alive preparing for transformation. The Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks began to sway, though the wind hadn't yet arrived, and she felt a peculiar anticipation in the air that she couldn't quite name. That night, around 2 in the morning, the storm broke with violence. Thunder cracked so loudly that her windows rattled in their frames, and rain hammered against the roof with such force she could barely hear herself think. Sarah had lived through plenty of Louisiana storms, but this felt different somehow, more personal. She was lying in bed, trying to convince herself to relax, when she heard it beneath the roar of the rain. A child laughing. At first she told herself it was a trick of the wind, some acoustic oddity created by the storm moving through the eaves and porches of the old house. But the sound came again, clearer this time. High and bright, the unmistakable peal of a young child's laughter, echoing from somewhere inside the main building. Sarah sat up, her heart already beginning to race. The plantation was locked. She had checked every door and window herself before returning to the cottage. There were no children anywhere on the property. The laughter continued, sometimes fading beneath the storm's fury, sometimes rising above it with crystalline clarity. It wasn't frightened laughter or malicious laughter. It was the sound of genuine joy, of play, as though somewhere in those darkened halls, a child was running and hiding and delighting in a game only they understood. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and rain jacket, already knowing she wouldn't be able to sleep until she checked the house, already knowing that she wouldn't find anyone there. She ran through the downpour to the main house, fumbling with her keys at the back entrance. Inside, the familiar rooms felt different in the storm's darkness. Her flashlight beam cut through shadows that seemed thicker than usual, more resistant to illumination. Water dripped somewhere deeper in the house, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rain outside. And then she heard it again. Not laughter this time, but footsteps. They moved across the upstairs veranda with deliberate, measured pace. Back and forth, as though someone was pacing while deep in thought. Sarah climbed the stairs slowly, her flashlight held before her like a shield. The footsteps continued, unhurried and clear despite the storm's noise. When she reached the upper floor and stepped out onto the veranda, they stopped. The rain fell through the spaces between the floorboards. The rocking chairs sat motionless despite the wind. Nothing human remained to explain what she had heard. She stood there in the darkness, rain misting against her face, and felt the weight of presence. Not threatening exactly, but undeniable. The house was full, even when it was empty. Whatever existed here didn't fear the living, didn't hide from them. It simply continued, patterns repeating like grooves, worn deep into stone by centuries of water flowing in the same path. Marcus Chen has worked as a night security guard at the plantation for 12 years. His shift runs from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. In all that time, he's developed a peculiar relationship with the phenomena that occur during rainstorms. He no longer tries to investigate every sound. He's learned that investigation reveals nothing except the absence of conventional explanation. Instead, he listens. On rainy nights, he positions himself in the main hall with his thermos of coffee and his logbook, and he documents what he hears. The children's voices, plural now, coming from the nursery wing. Sometimes they laugh. Sometimes they seem to be speaking to each other in voices too indistinct to make out words, just the cadence of conversation, of interaction. Once, during a particularly violent storm in late May, he heard what sounded like multiple children running down the main staircase, their feet creating that distinctive pattern of youthful footfalls, quick and light and chaotic. He turned his flashlight toward the stairs. Nothing. But the sound continued past him, racing toward the dining room, followed by a woman's voice calling out in French. He doesn't speak French, but he knows the tone. A mother calling her children, perhaps to come to dinner, perhaps to stop their running in the house. The authority and affection were unmistakable in any language. The singing started appearing in his reports about 5 years into his tenure. Always during rain, always the same female voice, always in French. Marcus eventually played a recording of it for a professor at a nearby university who specialized in Louisiana Creole history. The professor identified it as an old lullaby, a traditional song that would have been common among French-speaking families in the region during the 18th and 19th centuries. The melody was pure, the voice untrained but lovely, and it seemed to drift through the house without origin point. Sometimes it came from upstairs. Sometimes it floated from the direction of the old kitchen building. Sometimes it seemed to surround him completely, as though the singer was moving through the rooms, cradling an invisible child, singing them toward sleep. Marcus describes the experience as deeply unsettling, not because it's frightening, but because it's intimate. He feels like an intruder in these moments, witnessing something private and tender, something never meant for his ears. The voice carries such genuine warmth, such maternal care, that it creates a cognitive dissonance he still hasn't fully resolved. Ghosts, he thought, were supposed to be traumatic remnants, echoes of violence or grief. But this singing speaks of love, of routine, of the countless ordinary nights when a mother sang her children to sleep. It suggests that perhaps what remains in a place isn't always tragedy. Sometimes it's simply life, repeating its patterns beyond the boundary of death. Tour guide Rebecca Moreau has her own catalog of rain day phenomena. She's learned to adjust her schedule around the weather. On days when storms are forecast, the afternoon tours take on an unpredictable quality. Tourists have recorded audio on their phones that, when played back, contains voices that weren't audible during the actual tour. One family from Minnesota captured what sounded like a conversation between two women in French, discussing household matters, talking over the guide's explanation of the parlor furniture. Rebecca herself has heard the footsteps on the veranda so many times that she stopped mentioning them to tour groups. They happen almost every time it rains hard enough. That same steady pacing pattern that Sarah Thornton encountered. She's watched visitors' eyes track movement that isn't there, their heads turning in unison toward empty space as though following someone walking past. Children, especially, seem to see things their parents can't. They'll point to corners and ask who the lady is or why that boy is staring at them. Their parents see nothing. The most dramatic incident in Rebecca's tenure occurred during an overnight ghost tour event in October of 2018. A group of 15 enthusiasts had paid to spend the night in the house, equipped with recording devices and cameras. The evening started quietly, but around midnight, a storm system moved in unexpectedly. Within 20 minutes, the rain was falling in torrents, and the house came alive. Multiple guests reported hearing children's laughter simultaneously. The EMF detectors, whatever their actual scientific value, all began registering unusual readings. And then, captured clearly on at least 3 separate recording devices, came a child's voice. Small, uncertain, plaintive, speaking just 2 words in English. "Don't leave." The recordings were analyzed by several paranormal investigation teams afterward. No evidence of fraud was found. The voice doesn't match any of the adults present. It appears on devices in different parts of the room, at slightly different volumes, consistent with a single source point rather than a broadcast. And the emotional quality of those 2 words, the loneliness embedded in them, affected everyone who heard it. Several guests left immediately after, unwilling to stay the rest of the night. The phrase has haunted Rebecca ever since. Don't leave. A child's plea, echoing across generations, asking the living not to abandon them to the empty dark. Living with this kind of experience exacts a psychological toll that's difficult to articulate to those who haven't endured it. Sarah Thornton talks about the erosion of certainty, the way your grip on what's real and what's impossible begins to loosen when you're confronted night after night with phenomena that shouldn't exist. She started questioning her own perceptions, wondering if the isolation was creating hallucinations, if she was somehow generating these experiences through expectation or stress. But then other people would hear the same things. Guests would describe the exact same footstep patterns. Other staff members would report the French singing without any prior knowledge that anyone else had heard it. The consistency of the experiences across multiple witnesses made dismissal impossible, but acceptance nearly unbearable. Because if these things were real, then everything she thought she understood about the nature of reality was fundamentally incomplete. The worst part, she says, wasn't the phenomena itself. It was the never being alone. The constant awareness of presence, of observation, of sharing space with something you cannot see or understand, but can feel with absolute certainty. Every creak of the floorboards became a question. Every shadow held potential meaning. Sleep became difficult because darkness removed the thin comfort of vision, leaving only sound and sensation, and the knowledge that the house was full of memory, of remnants, of whatever echo remains when life has ended, but something essential hasn't entirely departed. Marcus Chen describes a similar exhaustion, but his has calcified into resignation. He's accepted that he works in a place where the normal rules don't fully apply. He's developed rituals, small acknowledgments of the presence around him. When he hears the children, he sometimes speaks quietly, telling them he means no harm, that he's just there to keep the house safe. He doesn't know if they hear him or care, but it makes him feel less like an intruder, more like a temporary cohabitant of a space that belongs more to the past than the present. The rain seems to act as a catalyst, lowering some barrier between what was and what is. Perhaps it's the water itself, conducting energy in ways we don't fully understand. Perhaps it's the sound, the white noise that makes other frequencies more perceptible. Or perhaps it's simply that storms create the right atmosphere, the right combination of darkness and sound and pressure that allows these echoes to surface from wherever they reside during quiet, sunny days. What remains clear is that for those who work at the plantation, who spend their nights in its halls or their days guiding strangers through its history, the rain brings a transformation. The house wakes. The past becomes present, and the line between memory and haunting dissolves into something that defies easy categorization. leaving only the raw experience of encountering what should not be. Night after rainy night, in a place where the dead have never entirely agreed to rest. The night of December 9th, 1871, began like any other evening at the Myrtles Plantation. The winter air hung cold and damp over the grounds, and inside the main house, Sarah Sterling Winter tended to her children as darkness settled across the Louisiana countryside. Her husband, William Winter, a lawyer and manager of the plantation, had just finished his evening meal. He was a practical man, respected in the community, with no reason to expect that the next few minutes would transform him from a living, breathing person into the plantation's most persistent and terrifying presence. What happened next would be recounted in hushed whispers for more than a century and a half, passed down through generations not as mere legend, but as documented fact witnessed by hundreds of people who would come to know the specific and undeniable rhythm of William Winter's final moments on Earth. Someone called for William from the front porch. The identity of that person remains unknown to this day. William rose from his chair, walked to the door, and stepped out into the cold night air. He may have recognized the figure waiting in the shadows. He may have had just a moment of confusion before the gun was raised. We will never know what thoughts crossed his mind in that final instant of normalcy. The gunshot shattered the evening silence. The bullet tore through William Winter's body, a wound that would prove mortal but not immediately incapacitating. In the terrible paradox of certain injuries, he remained conscious, aware, and driven by a singular desperate need to reach his wife, to make it back inside the house, to climb the stairs to where Sarah waited above. What William Winter did next would echo through time in the most literal sense imaginable. Mortally wounded, bleeding, dying with each heartbeat, he turned away from his unknown assailant and staggered back through the front door. His hands must have left marks on the doorframe as he pulled himself inside. His vision was likely already dimming, his body going into shock, but still he moved forward. Through the main hall he went, past the rooms where he had lived his daily life, toward the staircase that led to the second floor. He reached the stairs. Any rational assessment would suggest this is where he should have collapsed, where his strength should have finally abandoned him. But William Winter was not operating on rational thought anymore. He was operating on something deeper, more primal. Love, perhaps. Desperation. The human animal's fundamental refusal to surrender until the very last possible moment. He began to climb. The first step, the second, each one requiring a monumental effort of will over the body's rapid shutdown. The third step, the fourth, blood following his ascent, marking his progress. The fifth step, no. Witnesses would later describe the trail he left behind, the physical evidence of a man refusing to die until he had accomplished one final goal. Step 6. Step 7, Tunica. His breathing must have been labored, ragged. Step 8. Step 9. How his legs continued to function defies medical explanation. Step 10. Step 11. Sarah likely heard him by now. The irregular heavy footfalls, the sound of something terribly wrong. Step 12. Step 13. She would have appeared at the top of the stairs, her face transforming from curiosity to horror as she saw her husband's condition. Step 14. Step 15. He could see her now, just a few feet away. Step 16. Almost there. Almost safe. Almost home. Step 17. William Winter collapsed into Sarah's arms at the top of the staircase. His final journey complete, he died moments later, his blood staining her dress, his last breaths taken in the space he had fought so desperately to reach. The murder was never solved. No arrests were ever made. Theories abounded about business rivals, disgruntled former Confederate soldiers, personal vendettas, but the truth died with William Winter on those stairs. His body was buried. His family mourned. Time moved forward as it always does, but something remained behind. Something that would make the Myrtles Plantation the site of one of the most documented and undeniable hauntings in American history. It began, according to the earliest records, within months of William's death. Guests staying in the house reported hearing footsteps on the main staircase late at night. Not the ordinary sounds of an old house settling, not the explainable creaks of wood and nails. These were the distinct, unmistakable sounds of footsteps climbing stairs. Heavy footsteps. Labored footsteps. The footsteps of someone struggling with each step. The accounts describe a specific rhythm. The sound begins at the bottom of the staircase, always at the same location. The first step echoes through the quiet house. Then, the second. A pause. The third. The pattern continues with irregular timing, as though the climber is gathering strength for each successive step. Witnesses report that the sound is not of normal walking but of effort, of weight being dragged upward, of determination overcoming physical limitation. The footsteps climbed, one after another. Witnesses who have heard them report an overwhelming compulsion to count, to track the progress of the invisible climber. 4. 5. Detwined. 6. The sound grows clearer, more distinct as it ascends. 7. 8. 2. 9. Those who hear it describe a growing sense of dread, an understanding that they are witnessing something that should not be possible. 10. 11. 12. The footsteps continue their relentless upward journey. 13. 14. 15. By now, witnesses report that the air itself seems to change, becoming heavier, colder. 16. A longer pause. Then, 17. At the 17th step, the footsteps stop. A moment of terrible silence hangs in the air. Then comes the sound that has reduced hardened skeptics to tears, the sound that has sent countless overnight visitors fleeing into the night. The unmistakable sound of a body collapsing, the heavy thud of dead weight hitting the floor. Sometimes witnesses report hearing a faint exhalation, the final breath leaving lungs that no longer exist. Then silence. Complete and absolute silence. Until the next time it happens. The specificity of this haunting is what separates it from typical ghost stories and places it in a category of phenomenon that demands serious consideration. This is not a vague sense of unease or a shadowy figure glimpsed from the corner of the eye. This is a precise, repeating sequence that has been documented by hundreds of witnesses over more than a century. Always the same staircase, always the same number of steps, always ending in the same collapse. In 1994, a journalist from a national newspaper arrived at the Myrtles to write an exposé debunking the plantation's haunted reputation. His name was Marcus Feldman, and he had built a career on rational skepticism, on exposing the tricks and frauds of the paranormal industry. He requested to spend 3 nights alone in the house, armed with recording equipment and a confident smirk. The first night passed uneventfully. Feldman's initial article draft, recovered from his notes, dripped with vindication and smugness. The second night brought strange sounds that he attributed to wind and settling foundations. But the third night changed everything. At 2:17 in the morning, Feldman was sitting in the main hall reading when he heard the first footstep. His initial assumption was that someone had entered the house as a prank. He stood, ready to expose the trickster, his flashlight aimed at the base of the stairs. The second footstep came. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing, no person, no movement. Just the sound. The third step. The fourth. Taiwan. He counted them despite himself, feeling his skepticism crack with each impossible sound. Feldman's hands, he would later admit, began to shake around step 9. By step 12, he had backed against the far wall, his rational mind unable to reconcile what his ears were telling him. Step 13. Step 14. Step 15. He tried to speak, to call out, but found his throat closed with fear. Step 16. The longest pause. Then, step 17. The collapse sound came from directly above him on the second floor landing. Feldman described it as hearing a sack of wet cement dropped onto hardwood. The sound reverberated through the empty house. He stood frozen for a full minute before his legs responded to his brain's screaming command to run. Feldman left the plantation that night and never returned. His article, published 6 weeks later, was a complete reversal of his intended exposé. The final paragraph read, quote, "I went to the Myrtles to prove that ghosts do not exist. I can no longer make that claim with any certainty. What I heard on that staircase was not a trick or hallucination. It was the sound of something that happened over a century ago, still happening, still echoing through time. I have no explanation. I have only the memory of counting to 17 and the sound that followed. Professional paranormal investigators began serious documentation of the phenomenon in the early 2000s. Teams equipped with digital audio recorders, motion sensors, and infrared cameras set up elaborate monitoring systems focused on the staircase. The results have been consistent and disturbing. Multiple independent investigations have captured clear audio recordings of the footsteps. The recordings, when analyzed, show sound waves consistent with actual footfalls on wood stairs, complete with the creaking and settling sounds of weight being applied and released. Even more compelling are the recordings that capture multiple investigators simultaneously reacting to sounds that the human ear can hear, but that register at unusual frequencies on electronic equipment. In 2008, a team from a university parapsychology department recorded 17 distinct sounds, ascending the staircase over a period of approximately 42 seconds, followed by what their report described as a significant acoustic event, consistent with a large mass falling. Motion sensors placed on the stairs have registered sequential activations climbing from bottom to top, yet infrared cameras show no heat signature, no visible presence. The sensors detect something moving through space with enough mass to trigger the equipment, but that something remains invisible to every form of visual recording technology. Perhaps most unsettling are the accounts from multiple witnesses hearing the phenomenon simultaneously. During overnight investigations, groups of people standing in different locations throughout the house report hearing the same footsteps at the same time, counting the same 17 steps, flinching at the same collapse. This eliminates the possibility of individual hallucination or suggestion. These people hear something real, something that creates actual sound waves that multiple human ears detect simultaneously. The haunting is not constant, but occurs with disturbing regularity. Staff members who have worked at the Myrtles for years report that the footsteps are most commonly heard in the early morning hours, between 2 and 4 o'clock. Some nights pass in silence. Other nights, the footsteps are heard multiple times, as though William Winter is condemned to repeat his final journey over and over, forever dying but never dead, forever reaching for his wife but never quite arriving. Those 17 steps represent more than just a ghost story. They represent a man's final act of love and willpower. They represent the moment when William Winter's soul or consciousness, or some essential part of his being, became permanently imprinted on the physical location of his death. They represent the possibility that traumatic death can create a loop in time, a recording that plays back under the right conditions, allowing the living to hear the echoes of the dead. The Myrtles Plantation has many ghost stories, many legends, many reports of unusual phenomena. But the footsteps of William Winter stand apart. They are the plantation's most documented, most specific, and most undeniable manifestation of something beyond our current understanding of life and death. 17 steps, each one a defiance of mortality, each one a testament to the power of human determination, and each one a reminder that some deaths leave marks on reality itself that time cannot erase. The rain falls on the Myrtles Plantation tonight as it has for over 200 years, each drop landing on cypress shingles worn smooth by time and storms, running down columns that have witnessed both tender moments and violent ends. If you close your eyes and listen to recordings of this particular rain, this specific water falling on this particular roof, you can hear something beneath the rhythm, something older than memory, but newer than the present moment. The sound carries weight that ordinary rain does not, as if each drop remembers what it falls upon. People search for these recordings deliberately. They type the words into search engines in the middle of sleepless nights. Rain sounds from the Myrtles Plantation. Rain for sleeping. They download files and press play, inviting the acoustic ghost of this place into their bedrooms, into the vulnerable darkness where they close their eyes and surrender to unconsciousness. They seek comfort in the sound of water falling on a house where comfort has long since departed, where sleep might mean waking to a woman in a green turban standing at the foot of your bed, or footsteps climbing stairs toward a death that replays endlessly. Think about that choice for a moment. Of all the rain in all the world, of all the peaceful places where water might fall harmlessly on leaves or lakes or ordinary rooftops, They choose this rain. The rain that falls where Chloe may or may not have been hanged from an oak tree. The rain that washes over floorboards where Sarah Matilda died in her mother's arms. The rain that drums on the roof above the mirror that may or may not hold 3 souls behind its silvered surface. This is not an accident of algorithm or random selection. This is desire. What draws us to seek rest in a place where rest was stolen so violently from others? Perhaps it is the same impulse that fills the guest rooms of the Myrtles Plantation bed and breakfast night after night, year after year. Real people paying real money to sleep in rooms where other people died badly, where children were poisoned, where a man crawled bleeding up 22 steps and collapsed before he could tell his family who had shot him. The Myrtles does not hide what it is. The website mentions the hauntings. The tours detail the deaths. Guests know exactly what they are walking into when they cross that threshold. And still they come, carrying their suitcases up those same stairs where William Winter's phantom footsteps echo. The house operates in a strange duality. By day, it is beautiful in the way only Southern architecture can be, all delicate ironwork and elegant proportions. Gardens blooming despite the weight of history. Tour groups walk through sunshine-filled rooms, admiring chandeliers and antique furniture, learning about plantation life and architectural detail. But when darkness comes, when the last tour has ended and the guests retire to their rooms, the house becomes something else. The mirror waits in the hallway. The stairs remember blood. The handprints appear on surfaces that were clean moments before. And the rain falls, as it always has, as it always will, soaking into the earth that holds so many secrets, into wood that has absorbed so much sorrow. Tragedy does more than happen and fade. It seeps. It saturates. Like water into thirsty ground, violence and grief sink into the physical spaces where they occurred, staining the atoms themselves. The Myrtles Plantation has been soaking in tragedy for generations. The land itself was taken from people who belonged to it, built upon by people who enslaved others, maintained through suffering that stretched across decades. Even setting aside the famous haunting stories, even discounting every tale of Chloe and the children and William Winter, the foundation of this place is lost. Layer upon layer of human pain pressed into the soil like sediment forming stone. So when the rain falls, what is it touching? What is it running through? Does water remember the same way mirrors might, the same way houses seem to, the same way the air itself holds the impression of screams long after sound waves have dissipated into silence? The questions multiply like drops in a storm, and none of them have answers we can prove. Are Chloe and the children truly trapped in the mirror, their spirits bound to silver and glass by the rules of old superstition? Or does the mirror simply remember them so perfectly that it plays their images back like a recording? Is there a difference between being trapped and being remembered so intensely that you become present again? When guests report seeing the woman in the green turban, are they encountering a consciousness that knows itself, that experiences its own existence? Or are they seeing an echo, a pattern burned so deeply into reality that it repeats without awareness, the way a groove in a record plays the same music whether anyone is listening or not? William Winter's footsteps climb the stairs each night in some accounts, regular as clockwork, the sound of a dying man pulling himself toward help that never came. But why? Does some fragment of William Winter truly continue, unaware that he is dead, forever trying to complete that final journey to tell his family what happened? Or does the house itself replay his death because the violence of that moment cracked something in the fabric of the place, leaving a fault line that bleeds the past into the present whenever conditions align? Maybe William Winter is long gone, his soul or consciousness, or whatever animates us departed to wherever such things go. But his death was so traumatic, so soaked with fear and pain and desperate urgency, that it left a scar in reality itself. And what people hear is not William, but his absence, the William-shaped wound in the world. We want there to be answers. We want hauntings to make sense, to follow rules, to be one thing or another. Either ghosts are real, or they are not. Either the dead remain, or they do not. Either consciousness persists after death, or it ends. But the Myrtles Plantation offers no such clarity. It simply continues, rain falling on its roof, guests sleeping in its beds, phenomena occurring without explanation or pattern or proof, sufficient to satisfy skeptics or believers fully. And still the rain falls, and still people seek it out. This particular rain, this specific sound. They lie down in their own beds, hundreds or thousands of miles away, and press play, inviting the Myrtles into their ears, into their minds, into the last moments before sleep takes them. What are they hoping for? What do we want when we choose to rest to the sound of water falling on a haunted house? Perhaps we want exactly what we fear. We want to know that something persists, that love or pain or human presence can be strong enough to outlast death itself. When you close your eyes to the sound of rain on that roof, when you let that rhythm pull you down into sleep, you are sharing the darkness with those who never left. Chloe, if she exists, if she was ever real, is there in that sound. The children who died convulsing in their beds are there. William Winter climbing his stairs forever is there. And perhaps that is exactly what some part of us wants, to know we are not alone, even if our companions are the dead, even if comfort comes from tragedy, even if the lullaby that soothes us to sleep is sung by ghosts. The rain remembers everything. It falls on the guilty and the innocent alike. And we, the living, close our eyes and listen and sleep. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.